Extreme heat, record high temperatures, and drought are drying up pastures and forcing Texas ranchers to sell livestock in droves. Federal investigators are analyzing Hunter Biden's business activities as they near a critical junction, but prosecutors are possibly trying to avoid bringing politically sensitive cases to the Justice Department this close to an election. Meanwhile, Costco plans stores closure. More shortages and empty shelves are being seen across the country throughout several retailers, and America's freight, railroads, and are incredibly chaotic right now, and a disastrous rail strike may occur. And are we prepared for what comes next as regulators deny poultry producers' requests for Union Pacific railroad and railway train service? Plus, some good news for thousands of people because a recent $1 billion funding package capable of providing a huge stimulus for so many people has been approved and is intended to potentially save thousands of people at severe risk of total collapse from this ongoing threat to their family's survival. But first, the latest on President Joe Biden. Perhaps the only positive thing in the news today about Joe is the recent test results. Biden, 79, according to Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, is experiencing very mild symptoms. The president's primary physician said Biden began experiencing symptoms including a runny nose, fatigue, and an occasional dry cough last night. The president is expected to continue to work remotely and to continue to completely destroy this country and the hardworking American families from the comfort of his home or the residence at the White House, where he is expected to self-isolate for at least 5 days, according to current guidelines from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Jean-Pierre said that Biden has been in contact with members of the White House staff by phone and will participate in his planned meetings via phone and Zoom from the residence. Repeat line. Although Biden is fully jabbed and twice boosted, he has also begun taking Paxlovid, an antiviral therapy that was recommended by Dr. Kevin O'Connor, the president's physician. If any further updates are released, I'll be sure to bring them to you. And generations old, family ranchers are selling livestock off because many are unable to afford high hay costs to feed their cattle. Farmers know this hurts and it hurts bad, but sometimes you have to sell some cattle to keep a few. Last week, Monday, over 3,000 head of livestock were sold at the Decatur Livestock Market. Some farmers have resorted to using rotational grazing. Rotational grazing rotates farmers' herds through the pasture to allow other grassy spots to grow back for future feeding. If rain doesn't pour in to break the drought, it could break the bank for many ranchers and force them to dip into their winter reserves, and that is not good. Farmers who are already feeding hay now know that it is a long time until the frost, and it's going to be really hurting their pocketbooks when they run out of hay. This problem is affecting cattle ranchers that typically feed most of the U.S. Expect food shortages and empty shelves, and you should prepare now. And the federal investigation into Hunter Biden's business activities is nearing a critical junction. Investigators are weighing possible charges, but prosecutors are possibly trying to avoid bringing politically sensitive cases to the Justice Department this close to an election. We'll wait and see if a final decision will be made on whether or not to bring charges against President Biden's son, while recent discussions have centered around possibly bringing charges that could include alleged tax violations and making false statements in connection with Biden's purchase of a firearm at a time he would have been prohibited from doing so because of his acknowledged struggles with drug addiction. Republicans have already announced that if they take over the midterm elections, they plan to launch new investigations and hold hearings to examine the conduct of Hunter Biden and others in the Biden family. We will continue to certainly be keeping an eye on this and future developments as they unfold. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden announced another U.S. pledge of over $1 billion in weapons for Ukraine. This, the latest and 12th security package of Ukrainian stimulus, includes anti-ship systems and artillery rockets, amongst other things. Biden is maintaining his commitment and our tax dollars and defense arsenal stockpile to Zelensky. President Biden is standing by Ukraine as it defends its democracy and supports its sovereignty and territorial integrity against Russian aggression, while U.S. American citizens are struggling at home to buy food, groceries, earn a decent wage, and keep a roof over their heads. Oh, and criminals are continuing to kill our youth in schools and innocent people in grocery stores and shopping malls. And and did I mention the record high and rapidly rising inflation and crashing stock market and real estate markets? Biden also announced an additional $225 million in humanitarian assistance for Ukraine to address needs like safe drinking water, critical medical supplies, food, and cash for families to purchase essential items. But that is okay, because the western half of America is facing drought and a potential hydroelectric energy crisis, while states, counties, and cities are imposing fines for those who are just trying to bathe and possibly water their gardens to grow their own fruits and vegetables without being dangerously injected with chemicals and preservatives added by the USDA. Oh, and we also face one of the worst hospital nursing staff shortages in history, on top of record high medical health care coverage and insurance costs further complicated by bureaucracy and red tape. But at least Ukraine won't have to live in fear of food shortages and empty shelves as a result of farmers unable to produce and absorb high input costs for diesel fuel, equipment, labor, and fertilizer, or the hyperinflation seen on shelves and at self-checkout registers as a direct result of higher trucking transportation costs from the highest diesel prices in American history. They don't have to worry about that. But I guess these are all minor concerns that don't really affect most Americans, since we're all sitting on stacks of cash in our savings. Well, at least according to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's convinced Americans' hard-working middle class is just being lazy and refuse to work and earn income because they are flush with cash from all the stimulus checks they received during the pandemic through the CARES Act. Is that why there have been record Porsche sales, yielding the luxury auto manufacturer an impressive first half earnings report for 2022? Comment below, let me know what color Porsche you bought. The White House revealed that Biden spoke to Zelensky for over 30 minutes regarding the capabilities included in the latest aid package, which is really just a very fat stimulus package when you think about it. This marks the 12th U.S. military assistance installment for Ukraine since the start of the war. Since Moscow first invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the Biden administration has deployed more than 100,000 U.S. troops and turned the money printer on and cut checks for more than $5.6 billion in security assistance so far. But rest assured, Ukraine will pay us back, right? And somehow repay their debt for the lives of U.S. soldiers who will be lost but not forgotten. And yet, another threat to our food supply and our food's food supply, the STB, Surface Transportation Board, recently denied a California poultry and feed producer's request for an extension of an emergency service order covering Union Pacific grain trains. Fowler Farms, the largest chicken producer in the West, has been blocked and denied a 90-day extension of the emergency service order, which helped ensure thousands of dairy cattle and millions of chickens and turkeys received corn deliveries transported on UP or Union Pacific rail to Fowler Farms facilities from the Midwest. And Foster Farms told the STB that they are worried their corn supplies will fail to be replenished due to the ongoing union worker, labor, and crew shortages that Union Pacific is facing alongside Warren Buffett's BNSF and other larger railway companies like Norfolk Southern. All the while, Union Pacific yards have been routinely misrouting cars simply to get them moving and to give the false appearance of progress and worker activity. In a recent report provided by Michael Lindsay, a veteran engineer based in Pocatello, Idaho, used a train he recently ran to Nampa, Idaho as an example. Lindsay, the train's conductor, stated that the merchandise train labeled MNP HK15 had 146 cars, of which 22 were not supposed to be on his train, and included that cars for several misrouted destinations were placed carelessly throughout the train with seemingly zero regard for the supply chain or customer needs, becoming a much more normal occurrence on Union Pacific trains, he added. Cars for several misrouted destinations are placed carelessly throughout the train with zero regard for the supply chain or customer needs. Cars bound for California, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming, which were carrying commodities including diesel fuel, automobiles, tallow, and grain, see huge delays and further add to supply chain problems, inefficiency, shortages, empty shelves, and increased prices passed on to the consumers. Complete disregard made by the originating terminals and management takes a hit on their dwell time, and instead of working together for the same team, it has become common practice to kick the can down the road to the next terminal out of self-preservation of one's own terminal dwell numbers. Also, Lindsay's MNPHK was over the limit by 334 tons and was entered in the computer just to get it out of town. Lindsay said, "This bothers me immensely. I genuinely care about my industry as well as the customers. We, as the train crew, attempted to prevent this misrouting of customer cars by offering an easier and more efficient solution. Instead, local management cared more about their terminal dwell numbers than they did about delivering this freight to the customers. It would likely take a week or more for the wayward cars to ultimately reach their destination, and hauling them out of route also wastes fuel and capacity. According to railroader freight experts, it's not unusual for trains to depart yards with a wayward car or two in the consist. It is uncommon, however, for a train to contain 22 cars, or in this case, 15% of its entire consist. And this couldn't come at a worse time, as American freight railroads are increasingly chaotic right now, and union railroaders threaten a strike which would shut down at least 30% of U.S. freight and huge chunks of our economy. But are workers still powerless despite the recent pandemic-induced Great Resignation, with the looming threat of recession making matters worse for the working class poor, middle class barely getting by now, living paycheck to paycheck? According to Business Insider, Joblist surveyed hundreds of job switchers, and 26% said they deeply regret quitting their last job, and 42% said their new roles have not lived up to their expectations. So the grass isn't always greener on the other side, I suppose. Isabella Dane, an IT worker on the East Coast, got a new job this year and said she was able to command a higher price point, but now she isn't quite sure if it was the right move. Dane said her new job isn't a good culture fit for her, and the job requires her to work in the office every day, despite the firm telling employees that it was moving towards providing employees with more opportunities to work from home. Although Dane says the money is nice, she said she hasn't been working on growing a new team, which was the job that she expected to do when she was hired. Dane, 30, said, "I'm frustrated every day and I don't have the power to do anything about it." That's got to be a helpless feeling. Now, one reason she left her previous role was because she felt easily replaceable. But even after doing what millions of workers have done to try and assert their own power, quitting for more money and better workplace benefits, her new job hasn't measured up to her expectations. Unfortunately for Dane and the millions of other recent job hoppers, their window of power could be closing as fears of an economic slowdown loom. And this is what we spoke about in previous videos, the cash flow quadrant, moving from the left side to the right, and ditching the lifestyle of employee and self-employed and moving on to business owner and investor. But the Great Resignation, or Great Reshuffle, has been hailed as a reclamation of worker power. But as recession's fears throw cold water on the excitement of saying, "I quit," economists are saying that the truth about the Great Resignation isn't as rosy. Only certain workers have gained any true bargaining power, and even though the lowest wage workers have seen raises, soaring inflation has largely canceled them out. As the economy and wage growth continues to cool, they'll be the first to see their upper hand slip away, along with any savings they may have left and possibly their car too, as it gets repossessed right before they are evicted or foreclosed on. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, truckers are protesting at the Port of Oakland and bring our supply chain to a halt as dock workers refuse to cross the picket line. Are you a trucker? We all want to hear from you. So please be the actual boots on the ground. Contact me. My information is in the description below. For the third consecutive day, hundreds of independent truckers protest at the Port of Oakland. The truckers' main demand is the repeal of provisions in California State Assembly Bill 5, or better known as AB 5. California AB 5 would eliminate much of the independent trucking industry on the docks. In a peaceful and planned collective outcry to help save their means of income and ability to barely provide for their families, hundreds of truckers blocked the entrances to the docks with their trucks, bringing operations to a standstill. Independent owner-operator truck drivers have already seen several hardships with rapidly rising diesel fuel costs, which directly affect their ability to earn a profit. On top of freight dispatch brokers putting the squeeze on drivers in desperate situations and oftentimes being forced to take loads for far less than they're worth for the transportation haul just to earn only a few dollars so they can try to get by, leaving a lot of meat on the bone for the freight and logistics brokers to rake in huge profits. The protests in Oakland have grown significantly since Monday, when roughly 100 truckers took part. And according to FreightWaves, Tuesday's protest saw an increase to between 900 and 1,000. Port operations were heavily impacted Wednesday, and the action is set to continue through the week. Truckers are also discussing the possibility of a demonstration at the state capitol of Sacramento. According to FreightWaves, roughly 100 dock workers honored the picket line Tuesday, blocking the Trapac and Everport terminals and shutting down most container movement at the port. This is all the more significant given that the International Longshore and Warehouse Union has kept 22,000 dock workers across the West Coast on the job for nearly 3 weeks since their contract expired July 1. The Biden administration has been working closely with both parties to prevent a work stoppage on the ports, even though the Pacific Maritime Association, or the PMA, is demanding major concessions on automation and working hours. A possible strike by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU, would be a devastating blow to our economy, and we would likely see increased food shortages and empty shelves at grocery stores and retailers across the country as a result. Planned work stoppages at West Coast ports, which collectively handle roughly 40% of the country's imports and a comparable fraction of exports, could disrupt ongoing war efforts as well. And we all know how lucrative and profitable war is to our political leadership in Washington. Most U.S. weapons arming NATO proxy forces in Ukraine are shipped from seaports like the Port of Oakland in California. Meanwhile, the U.S. is actively ratcheting up tensions with China over Taiwan, which could require rapid deployments of even more military-related materials from West Coast ports. Across the U.S. and the world, a mood of rebellion is taking hold among truckers and other freight and gig workers. Truck drivers in South Korea went on strike for 8 days in June, virtually shutting down ports all over the country, as they rallied together against skyrocketing fuel prices and a payment structure that encourages dangerous driving to speed up deliveries and threatens to put lives at risk. This week, dock workers at 6 major seaports in Germany launched their third strike this year. Dock workers in the United Kingdom voted this week to authorize strike action, demanding wages that keep pace with the high rate of inflation. Can't argue with that. Owner-operators represent roughly 2/3 of California's port truckers, and trucks, in turn, are the primary land-based method of moving cargo in and out of California's ports. At present, these truckers are dispatched on a contract basis by logistics companies, while truckers own and maintain their own vehicles. The AB 5 law affects the broad swath of the state's workforce, including Uber drivers who are also classified as independent contractors and therefore exempt from receiving a guaranteed hourly wage and benefits. but it would also affect an estimated 70,000 owner-operators in the trucking industry, allowing companies to hire them for contract work only if it is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. So, for example, owner operators cannot be contracted by a port trucking company to move cargo in and out of ports, which many owner operator truck drivers rely on for their revenues and ultimately their net income. This would force owner operators to either sell their trucks, potentially at a huge loss, and become direct employees of a company, move out of state, or start their own independent business and cover substantial administrative and insurance fees and paperwork. By some estimates, the latter option could incur costs of $20,000 per year for drivers already struggling to break even as it is. After hundreds of truck drivers began protesting the law with intentions of planned work stoppages, the California governor's office issued a statement. Deputy Press Secretary Daniel Villasenor said in an email that the office of California Governor Gavin Newsom, Democrat, and potential 47th presidential candidate unless the current president, Joe Biden, runs for a second consecutive term, which I'm not sure if our country can honestly survive another 4 years of that, is looking into the concerns raised by the California Trucking Association regarding enforcement of the state's landmark AB 5 labor law. Villasenor noted, however, that AB 5 was signed into law in 2020, giving industries 2 years to plan for compliance before the Supreme Court declined to hear the Trucking Association's appeal, and states the Supreme Court's decision not to hear the case does not change any of the law's requirements. And Cindy Perez, a Long Beach owner-operator and organizer of this week's protest, said a delay of AB 5's enforcement to allow carriers to comply would help those like her and her husband who have worked a combined 15 years in drayage. Drayage is the transport of goods over a short distance in the shipping and logistics industry. But she said it's not what her and her husband and other truckers honking their horns and refusing to haul cargo really want. Cindy Perez said her goal is to get exempted from AB 5, to get carved out from it, just like other industries, and if not, they at least want to know why. The California Labor Agency is working with those requesting assistance in complying with the state law. And Governor Gavin Newsom's office statement said the agency will continue to update guidance as necessary. Stay tuned for more on that. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and turn on notifications, and I'll be sure to bring you guys more updates as they come about.